Okay, so it looks like we have a good amount of practitioners on the phone or on the call with us today, and many of other in the other category. So if you have a chance, if you could type in who you are, that would be helpful as far as knowing who else is out there that's not represented on the list that we currently have. Let's launch our second poll. What percentage of the boys that your organization serves are boys or young men of color? Please choose the option that's most applicable. So it looks like more than 50% of you are working very closely with young men of color. And this webinar, I think, will be extremely helpful for you in your work and in your role. And for those of you who are working with some boys and young men of color, this will also be very helpful. But it looks like the majority of you are within the larger category. So for today's webinar, our panelists include Mike Garinger and Brian Sales. Mike serves as the Director of Knowledge Management for Mentor, overseeing projects related to the translation of mentoring research into program practice. Mike has worked in the mentoring and education fields for over 17 years, primarily on the training and technical assistance projects serving federally or state-funded mentoring programs. Mike has authored and edited many guidebooks and program tools to support youth mentoring in school and community settings, such as Foundations of Successful Youth Mentoring, a guidebook for program development, Building Effective Peer Mentoring Programs in Schools, and the Oregon Mentors Evaluation Instrument Toolkit. We also have Brian Sales, who's the Director of Training and Technical Assistance at Mentor. Brian has worked in the youth development field for 25 years. He has direct experience running runaway and homeless youth programs, substance abuse prevention programs, school, community, and foster care mentoring programs, and working for college access programs for first-generation youth in high school and college campus settings. In addition, he has taught courses on multicultural studies, African American history, and conducted trainings on cultural competency. I will now turn it over to Mike Garinger to go over the table of contents and begin the first section of the webinar. Mike?
Great, thanks, Liz, and welcome everybody. I'm excited about our webinar today and the topics that we're going to be covering here. I know that we've been doing a series of trainings and webinars on how to serve boys and young men of color more effectively through mentoring, and a lot of that to date is focused on the relationship side. How do we get volunteers and the young people they're serving to have strong, healthy, meaningful relationships with one another? I think today we're going to emphasize a little bit what you that are running programs and funding programs and setting up initiatives, what are the things that you all need to keep in mind about how that work gets done and how you support those relationships in effective ways. So to do that, we're going to start by talking about kind of the core elements of effective practice. And I know many of you probably have some familiarity with that general resource, but we'll take a look at some of the basics around that real quick. But then we're going to move into also some additional recommended practices for serving boys and young men of color. And we'll talk about why there's a need for some additional best practices and ways of doing things in that audience. And then certainly throughout and at the end, we're going to talk quite a bit about resources and other TA support that will help you in this work, and certainly answer any questions that you all have about the content we present today. So next slide, please. So I think I want to start with an overview of the elements themselves and really dive a little bit deep into kind of why these practices matter for running a quality program. So for those of you that are not familiar with the elements of effective practice, if we could go to the next slide, please. The elements of effective practice for mentoring is something that Mentor has been publishing in various forms for about 25 years now. The first edition came out in 1990, I believe. And it's something that we've updated periodically throughout the years, most recently releasing the 4th edition of it this past August. And at its core level is a collection of research-informed practices for youth mentoring programs. It really tries to codify much of the research that we have about what makes mentoring effective, and it also gives guidance to programs around what it is that their staff needs to be doing to create those impactful relationships and achieve kind of the overall goals and outcomes, not only for the young people they serve, but for the program itself. The main document consists of 6 evidence-based standards: recruiting, screening, training, matching and initiation of matches, monitoring and support, and then ending with closure. And you'll notice that that kind of is built around the life cycle of a mentoring relationship. There's another section at the end that gets into kind of program management and leadership and some ethical principles that we think are important to mentoring programs. But most of this is kind of what practitioners like yourselves need to be doing to promote successful mentoring. Now, for each of those 6 standard areas, you'll find a set of benchmarks. Benchmarks are things that the research we have on mentoring really suggests are important things to be doing, critical things to be doing, if you will, that can really make sure that your services are well implemented. We also have enhancements in there. Now, these are things that the research is maybe hinting are a good idea. There are things that may not be applicable to all programs and all models of mentoring, but there are things that we think are also a good idea. So we always encourage programs to look at those enhancements and see if any of them apply to your work. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today for mentoring boys and young men of color falls pretty squarely into these enhancements category in terms of recommendations and things that you can do to make your services even a little bit better for that specific population of young people. So on the next slide, I want to, I'm not going to go through all of the, benchmarks and enhancements. That would take several hours to get through all of them, but I think I will highlight a few major themes that folks will find in the 4th edition. One was we put a lot of emphasis on the empowerment and engagement of mentees and their families in this edition, and I think that really speaks to a lot of what, in my mind, will make mentoring for boys and young men of color impactful and effective, doing that in a way that honors their families, honors the culture and values and community that they are coming from. And there's some advice in the new edition for practitioners on how to do that. We also emphasized kind of the documentation of the running of the program. You'll notice a lot more references in there to things needing to be in writing and codified and written down. I've seen way too many programs over the years kind of lose all of their institutional knowledge when a key staff member walks out the door. And so we've really emphasized that how you do things needs to be written down and followed and give your program some kind of sustainability and continuity through inevitable staffing changes. There's also a lot of information about kind of what I'd call innovations that are happening in the field, some things around youth-initiated mentoring, and we'll certainly talk more about that in relation to boys and young men of color. We also talk about different program models besides just kind of one-to-one. Most of our research is kind of on Big Brothers, Big Sisters style one-to-one matches, but I'm seeing a lot of growth in group mentoring, team mentoring, and different kinds of structures. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. Also more of an emphasis on closure. I think how mentoring relationships end is just as critical as how they begin and what happens during them. So we'll talk a little bit about that through a boys and young men of color lens here at the end of our session. And then also an emphasis on evaluation. I think we really encourage programs to, and I don't just mean evaluating your outcomes in some kind of big fancy random control trial study. That's not for everybody or every program. But even just evaluating your efforts to make sure that you're implementing the program as intended. Are you doing what you say you're going to do for children and families and volunteers? So I'm happy to answer questions about any of these themes, but we'll save that till a little later in the presentation. I think on the next slide here, though, I want to emphasize that the elements of effective practice are intended to be fairly global. They're the recommendations that we have for just about every program out there. So I certainly expect and hope that everyone on this call is paying attention to them as you design and deliver your services. But I think, there's a need for some additional things for serving boys and young men of color more effectively. So to that end, we are working on an additional guidebook that'll have kind of additional benchmarks and enhancements and recommendations that we hope you all will bring to your work. I think that's due to be released in April. I think you're getting a little bit of a sneak preview of some of the content of that here today. So we'll be talking quite a bit about how programs can, tailor their work to be more culturally responsive and respectful, give mentors insights into the things that they will need to know to support a young man of color effectively, and then, really talking about how to engage youth and families, like I said, in a meaningful and authentic way. So a little bit of a sneak preview for a resource that's coming down the road. So I think, one last argument that I will make here, and I hear from practitioners all the time, is, is it really that important that I follow these kind of, research-informed practices? We're kind of doing our own thing here in our program. And, you see the wolves howling at the moon here. I think the question we all have is our work impactful? Are we really making a difference? And I think we've got pretty clear research that, following effective practices, research-based practices, it really does improve the quality of your relationships. It emphasizes, like I said, the fidelity to what it is you're doing. Are we actually walking our talk in terms of how we provide our service? And I think if it provides a roadmap for others, and I think that's what we're doing here on this webinar, is talking about what are some things your program can do structurally to make it more effective. On the next slide, just to kind of reemphasize this point, we do have research from one of David Dubois' meta-analyses of about 80 mentoring program evaluations. We're kind of mushed together to look at how impactful they were kind of broadly. And I think what he found was that the more programs implemented empirically based practices, meaning practices that are derived from research around how they recruit, how they screen, how they train, how they make matches, how they close matches, you can see that those programs, the number of practices that they implemented that were research-based, their impact, their effect size of their program went up considerably compared to kind of the more aqua line there where people were kind of winging it and kind of, they thought they had a good idea and were doing it right, but it was more theory-based than research-based. So I only bring this up to say that we do know that these things really matter in terms of the quality of your program and the relationships that you're making. Now, I'll also say that, the research we have in mentoring is still, unfortunately, a little bit limited, and I think there's a recognition in our field that not all youth and their families are coming from the same place. Some programs serve youth that are dealing with challenges that other programs don't, and the delivery of quality mentoring is heavily influenced by cultural elements, community values, local circumstances, and these are all things that I think the basic elements, struggle a little bit to speak to effectively. And so I think programs serving boys and young men of color will need to consider some other things. So think of the elements as important to your work and a real roadmap for your work, but I think some of the other things we'll be talking about throughout this webinar can put a finer point on the work you do for these particular children and young men. So with that, I'd like to start going through the elements categories themselves, and Brian and I are going to kind of do a tag team thing here where we walk you through the elements that we think are most important to your work from kind of the existing version of the elements, but then also talk a little bit about kind of the boys and young men of color lens that we would put on some of these things. So it might be tweaking one of the benchmarks that's already in there, or it might be a case of coming up with a benchmark or an enhancement or an additional recommended practice that I think speaks to the work that you all are doing for these young men. So let's get down to it with recruitment here. We'll start there. And I think what you'll see when you look at the elements is really an emphasis on targeted strategies, and that applies to every mentoring program. You all need to be thinking a little bit strategically about who we want to walk in the door and volunteer to be a mentor. But I think it also applies to the recruiting of youth to a program and how you bring families into a program. You'll notice that one of the benchmarks that's in the core elements is B13, which is reflects on how mentors' skills and backgrounds and motivations apply to your program, and that your recruitment efforts should be targeted around those things. I'm guessing that most of your programs are not just taking any warm body that walks through the door. You're looking either for men or men of color or men from a certain background or individuals that have a certain skill that they bring to the relationship. And so I encourage everyone on this call to think about what are those skills and backgrounds and motivations that matter in your mind to serving the youth that are in your program. I've seen a lot of mentoring programs serving boys and young men of color really emphasize things like race or gender and who they're recruiting. And I'm not going to say that those are bad things, but I've also seen many of those programs struggle to find a sufficient number of volunteers that meet, criteria that might be a little narrowly defined. And so what you don't want is a lot of your young people on wait lists for long periods of time waiting for the perfect person to walk through the door. So I encourage everyone to think carefully about kind of those criteria and who it is that you're setting out to recruit. I also think, in B16, same with the young people. What do they want to get out of mentoring, and is that a good fit for what you're offering? I always encourage programs, yes, you've got a vision for your program and what it does, but each child will bring some unique needs and desires to their mentoring experience. And so I hope that you're doing outreach to youth and families that are a good fit for what it is your program then wants to do. I think some recommended additional boys and young men of color recruitment practices, and this isn't rocket science necessarily, but really targeting your recruitment efforts to institutions and approaches that'll reach men of color. If, once again, this is critical in your mind to what it is you're trying to achieve. There's a couple of tools that I will point to here, and they're available as handouts in the handout panel on the right-hand side. One is the Black Male Mentoring Handbook. This is a resource that I believe the United Way in Philadelphia did a few years ago. Fantastic resource for building a recruitment campaign that specifically would interest Black men to get involved in the lives of young men of color. It takes kind of a social marketing emphasis in the content, so all about reaching these folks where they're at, and then hitting them with messages that would resonate with them. And there's a fantastic checklist in there for testing to see whether your recruitment messages would resonate with men of color as part of your recruitment. So I won't get too deep into that, but it's a free resource for downloading, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I think looking more broadly at recruiting men in general, our mentoring partnership up in Michigan has produced a fabulous toolkit called the Men in Mentoring Toolkit. That's available online for free, and it's got a plethora of tools and templates and strategies and outreach plans for specifically targeting men to serve in mentoring programs. I think the demographics in our field are that, I think 70% of people that volunteer in mentoring programs are women. And so while I certainly think they're capable of mentoring young men of color in many ways, we do need more men to step up and do this work. And so I think both of these resources will be helpful in that regard. Some additional kind of things that folks may want to consider in terms of how their program is structured and delivered. I think programs serving young men of color might want to consider doing a group or team model. Group meaning one or a couple of mentors matched with a larger group. Team meaning multiple mentors working with a smaller group of young people, so the young person's getting mentoring from multiple adults, not just one. These programs tend to be more activity-based and recreational, which can kind of take the edge off a little bit of some of the, uncomfortableness around, sharing, divulging information about oneself and talking about problems. I'm not going to say that boys and young men of color find that more difficult than other young people, but certainly I think this is a strategy that can help young people that don't have a lot of practice coming out of their shell and talking about stuff. It can provide a setting in which that might be more comfortable. These programs also kind of promote perspective taking. They get to hear more voices and more opinions and interact with their peers and adults in just a variety of ways that's beyond what you get if you're just matched with one adult mentor kind of one-on-one. I also think it's important to consider the messaging to parents. There are mentoring programs that are extremely explicit about what it is they want to do for boys and young men of color. They've got a fairly, set view on what these young men need to learn and consider as they approach adulthood, and that's fine, but I don't think every family and every young man of color that may come to your program is necessarily going to be in a place where that's what they need at that particular time. So really paying attention to what parents are asking of you. What is it that your community is telling you that they need for their young men and their boys? So, I think there's an expectation sometimes that a program needs to be able to serve everybody in the same way, and I don't think that's always the case. So think, once again, if you're putting a lot of time and effort into thinking about who you're asking to volunteer, I think it's important to put equal consideration into who it is you're asking to serve as a mentee and what it is that you're telling and offering that family as they make a decision about participating in your program or not. I want to move on to screening, and to be honest, I don't have a lot of information here that I think is directly applicable to boys and young men of color. I think most of the practices that you'll see in the screening section are just around youth safety and making sure that our programs are free of I will say unsavory individuals that may be signing up to mentor a child for the wrong reasons. And so a lot of that cuts across every program. There isn't really a boys or young man of color lens on any of that. It's just about kind of basic program safety and making sure that you've covered your bases from a liability perspective. But there you will also see some recommendations in there around screening mentors for suitability. And on B26, you'll see there is a need to get mentors to commit to the frequency, volume, and duration of the mentoring relationship. And that's true of every program. But I think if you're serving young men that are vulnerable, that have already been through a lot, that have had a lot of adults not be there for them over their lives, I think it's absolutely critical that you screen out anybody who is even slightly iffy about making that level of commitment. We know that when mentoring relationships fail suddenly and early, that it's more harmful to youth than if they never had a mentor in the first place. So your programs do have potential to do harm to young people, and so I think it's really important to screen out mentors that may not be in it for the long haul. You'll see a mention in E25 about being careful around using college students or young men of that age as mentors. Their lives are chaotic. They got stuff going on. They're moving. They're taking jobs. They're going to school. That's led to a lot of, I think, relationships that have been abandoned or not lasted as long as we'd like. If they're doing it through school, say through a university course or through a fraternity or whatever it may be, that can also skew their incentives for participation. I've heard horror stories of programs where the mentors got the credit they needed from the course after the first semester and didn't show up for the second and third semesters. So you certainly, I'm not saying don't use college students. If you can make that work for your program, it's a great win, but they sometimes, have trouble in the kind of the longevity department. I think some additional screening practices that I'd recommend for your programs would be for programs that are on a school year or otherwise cyclical in schedule where there's a lengthy off period. Consider ways for matches to stay in touch: text, email, phone calls, letter writing, whatever it may be, Facebook. Certainly technology has expanded our possibilities here. But we do know that in the education arena, concepts like summer learning loss, that impacts boys and young men of color disproportionately. And I think it's important that mentors can be working with young people over the summer and emphasizing the need to kind of stay engaged educationally, even if it's just reading some books and talking about them with their mentor. I think anything mentors can do to help offset that disproportionate impact there is important. And certainly, not taking a 3-month break from your relationship over the summer, I think it prevents what I'd call relationship learning loss as well. I'd also just lastly here recommend screening your mentors or your prospective mentors for the suitability of the message and theme of your program. And we've talked on some of our other webinars and trainings here about what we would call perhaps conscious mentoring for boys and young men of color, where we're getting them to really reflect on their racial identity, build that up, and learn what it means to be a strong young man of color in our society. You're going to need to have mentors that can do that work well and be able to reflect on their own self and their own life. If they're bringing a lot of baggage to the relationship, or if they have feelings about young people today or what the boys you serve need to hear that are incompatible with your own program's values, then that's somebody that you may want to not have participate as a mentor. So, make sure that they understand the positive youth development principles that your program is built around. If they seem prescriptive, if they talk a lot about like whipping young men into shape and fixing a broken generation of kids, I can almost guarantee they're not going to be a great fit for what it is you're trying to do. So I think I'm going to stop there. Delia, real quick, do we have any questions from the audience, or should we move forward to...
Yeah, we have one question, Mike, which is folks want to know about services that we recommend or that you recommend for, or resources for screening mentors.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of what gets talked about in screening is just simply criminal history background checks, and certainly there's different ways of doing that, both through, kind of private firms can do that kind of thing for you. Local law enforcement is often the gateway to that. Unfortunately, there is no national law about how background checks get done, so it does vary quite a bit from state to state. We can send out some information later that kind of can point people in the right direction on how those background checks do get done in their particular state. But I would encourage folks to think about screening more holistically. So it's not just about that criminal history, although I would say that you also need to think about, once you get that criminal history back, what matters to you. I've talked to a lot of programs serving boys and young men of color that lament the fact that they've got a lot of older men that may have at one point been involved in not the best lifestyle choices in their own youth, that have turned their lives around and want to reach out and help today's young people, and they butt up against a criminal record that they then need to make a decision around. So I encourage folks to think about what would be allowable. How much do you care about certain things that may pop up in one of those record checks? Some of them, I think, carry more weight than others, clearly. I'd be hesitant to bring on anyone that had an extremely violent history or had, been convicted of crimes involving children. But programs can set those boundaries wherever they and their funders and their legal counsel are comfortable. So, but thinking through, what are those criteria? What would be our cutoff line? But also thinking more holistically about screening. How do you do your interviews? What questions do you ask? How do you check references? What do you ask of them? Are they going to be transporting the young man in their car? You might want to do a driving records check. So it's going to look different from for every program, but I think I really like emphasizing screening folks for both their safety and their suitability. I think programs really fall down sometimes on that suitability piece and let people into mentoring relationships that may not be coming from the healthiest place themselves. And I think for this population of young people, that's certainly a priority to avoid.
And we're getting some great questions and follow-up questions. So in the interest of time, why don't we save those towards the end, and we'll revisit as many as we can at the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Brian Sales, who's going to talk to us a little bit about practices and a few other elements areas here.
Thanks a lot, Mike, and thank you, Delia. Frederick Douglass's quote, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." So this sets the tone for program practices and for individuals in their working relationship to working with boys and young men of color. Next slide. So when we talk today, we're talking about culturally responsive training practices. Part of my discussion in the next several slides is to sort of reinforce some of the earlier webinar topics around cultural competence. So we're talking about developing cultural competence with our mentors, regardless of their background. In particular, sometimes programs will think because they recruit African American and Latino Hispanic American mentors that they necessarily have all of the relational skills necessary to be both good advocates and supporters of young men. But we know from mentoring research and youth development research that the skills that are necessary and needed require mentors to be trained. So around cultural competence, we expand the notion of what that means. Next slide. So the element on training here, research again supports the importance of mentor training, in particular around mentor attunement. That is the ability for a mentor to be attuned or connected to the young person and positive youth outcomes. We've seen in our research that Dr. David Dubois has put forth the improvement in mentee grades, positive pro-social behavior, and of course, emotional well-being. And most importantly, in Martin and Siffer's research, we see an increase because of training, both in mentor satisfaction and confidence. Next slide. So when we think about the elements and we talk about training, the training features that we have discussed earlier around the basic training elements, we think about the particular enhancements, specifically how it relates to culture, gender, race, religion, socioeconomic status, and other demographic characteristics. So we've already sort of talked about, and you all have access to the MBK handbook, but topics need to be tailored and customized to the needs of the particular mentees in a recognition of how those cultural differences, gender differences, race differences, language differences, and socioeconomic differences can have and oftentimes do have an impact on the mentor-mentee relationship. Next slide. So when we look here and we think about training mentors, we think about, in particular, African-American sort of cultural practices, and I have sort of a quick snapshot, and I don't mean for this to be completely representative of all African-Americans in general, but this sort of a general kind of snapshot. When we look at the African-American historical and cultural experience in America, we talk about the strengths of the African-American family, the African-American community, the extended family and why that's so important, spirituality and religion and the role and the basis that it plays in providing support both to the community and to individuals, the belief, of course, in education and a work ethic that supports going to school, receiving an education, and also being committed to that particular community and the family. Some of the challenges, obviously, we know a lot of the challenges. I don't need to go through a litany. Many of the challenges that African Americans face around discrimination and being scapegoated, high unemployment rates, rates of violence in some of the inner city communities, differences in terms of language and behavioral style, how it can oftentimes be mistaken for resistance and denial. So when we're beginning our practices in terms of our training practices, what's important is to have an understanding, have staff on hand who understand the African American historical experiences, and the particular way in which you need to frame that in your training is that you reflect it with your understanding of both exercises that speak to the African American cultural and historical experiences. The most important thing, I think, when organizations are putting together their training practices is that they use examples that come specifically from that particular community. Next slide. Some of the research that we found recently, Dr. Noel Hurd, who is who's been a part of the mentoring community and was on our research board, talks about natural mentors. Oftentimes in the African American community, there are not necessarily these formalized mentoring relationships as we know them. For instance, sort of a big brothers, big sisters model. But they're individuals. There's uncles. There's non-parental adults. There are people that are in the barber shop. There are coaches. There's teachers. There's other individuals who play an instrumental role in helping to support young people in developing a positive racial identity. So there's a lot that we can learn in the formal mentoring world, in particular around how to support African American youth. One of the things that Noel's research speaks to is it talks about how natural mentors oftentimes teach and model coping skills for young people, in particular African American community, to deal with both oppression and adversity. Next slide. For Latino American cultural practices, I think it's also, you can see some of the some similarities as it relates to the African American experience, the importance of the family and extended family, the importance of religion, the importance of culture and tradition, how education is valued, and how gender roles can often be assigned. Some of the challenges around language, system differences, and some of the financial pressures that oftentimes make it very difficult for parents and children, especially when they're in low-income communities. Next slide. And again, I think what's really important is understanding in your particular community that Latinos are not a homogeneous group in America. The majority of Latino Hispanic Americans in this country are of Mexican origin, but many of them are from Puerto Rico, or from Cuba, from Colombia and Brazil, the Caribbean, El Salvador. And Latinos are also diverse in that they also have a background that they may also be both white, they could be black, they could be a mixture of, Indian background and so forth. So it's really important for us to understand when we're working with a Latino youth, whether or not we are an organization that just focuses on Latinos or have a disproportionate amount of Latino youth that are in the group, that are in your organization, that you're able to understand the differences, both about how you particularly support those particular communities and recognizing the differences amongst them. Next slide. The Pew Hispanic Institute did a study between two worlds that I think is really important for us to understand. The growing number of Latinos between 16 and 25, two-thirds of these young Latinos are born in the United States. 22%, according to this study, are unauthorized, again, 68% of Mexican ancestry. And I think what's really important to understand is that 36% of these young Latinos are in English-dominant households, and 41% of them are in bilingual households where they're speaking both Spanish and English, and then 23% are in Spanish-dominant. And I think when we talk a little bit about sort of match support practices, it's really important to understand the type of young person in the community that they're coming from. Are they coming from a family that speaks predominantly Spanish? Are they coming from a family that's English dominant? Are they in a bilingual household? That helps you understand the type of young person in the community that they'll be coming from in your interaction with them. Next slide. So again, thinking about sort of practice-based training practices, we talked earlier a little bit about teaching relational skills to mentors, making sure that the mentors have those particular skills that are clearly attuned with working with young people. Also, we talk about cultural self-assessments. Many mentoring programs have the ability to offer up both individual cultural assessments for their mentors in the description how a person is, one, be able to engage in a conversation both with the organization that they're coming from and with the particular assessment that they will do about their own self. So if you're a person that's coming from a non-African American Latino background, how are you able to connect with this young person? What are the particular similarities that you have regardless of your background? And when you're doing this sort of cultural assessments, you get a better sense of both your own identity and also how you are able to have the appropriate connectivity to the young person based on your own personal assessment. A lot of the mentor trainings today are starting to really take into account cultural competency, and specifically there are various exercises that mentoring programs will often use in these cultural assessments. The other thing I think is really important is recognizing that there can be cultural tension up front. So I think it's important, at least initially, to do some sort of role play with your mentors in your programmatic practices, specifically around training and in particular around monitoring relationships to understand some of the cultural differences. What oftentimes can happen, in my experience in running programs, is if you haven't prepared your mentors well, oftentimes they can feel like they might feel burnt out, they don't feel supported, and they can feel increasingly stressed out in the mentoring relationship if they haven't gotten the basic relational skills and the cultural attunement up front. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the benchmarks, matching and initiating. There's limited research, but there is some research. Dr. Bernadette Sanchez, who is at DePaul University, has offered up quite a bit of a better understanding around practices related to matching. But what we have here in terms of our benchmarks is what we should do when thinking about a mentor-mentee match is obviously we think about suitability. We think about interest, we think about proximity, how close are the mentor and mentee are to each other, their age, gender, race, ethnicity, personality, and so on and so forth. What's also important, there are certain programs, in particular, I would say younger age programs, where you have the parent or guardian list their preferences of the type of mentor that they might want to have. Again, there's programs that are race, ethnic, language-specific programs that work well, and there's some programs that work across race. So again, thinking about those particular interests and those characteristics, are very important when making your matches. Next slide. So some of the tools that Dr. Bernadette Sanchez recommends for organizations are the Cultural Mistrust Inventory for Adolescents, helps to provide young people and mentors a understanding for them to be able to sort of explore experiences such as prejudice and discrimination. And also there's the Ethnic Identity tool and instrument used to assess both youth and racial identity to help them promote a healthy ethnic and racial identity amongst the participants. So it's one of the things that I think that she recommends that I think is an important practice is to consider the benefits, the potential benefits of matching young people with weaker ethnic identities, meaning that young people who may not have a strong affiliation with their Latino or African American heritage with a mentor who has a strong ethnic identity to promote positive racial and cultural identity. So that's one of the things that you can think about when you're making a match. Next slide. This is oftentimes it can be a controversial topic with programs, but we certainly think that same race and cross race programmatic practices are very important. The research is kind of mixed. We see that there are oftentimes pretty positive outcomes with both same race and cross race. I've worked in both types of programs. Studies reveal that mentors need to be culturally competent in order to be successful in cross race pairs. And Sanchez and Cologne 10 years ago or 11 years ago in their research that came to that particular findings. But also we found from Gene Rose's research that cross race mentors oftentimes can have even more positive outcomes in mentoring relationships. But the most important thing for organizations is making sure that you develop the cross-race mentor. So if it's a white mentor with a Hispanic Latino mentee, that they have the appropriate training. Move on to the next slide. So Dr. Roger Jarjur, another member of our next research board, talks about his research findings on African Americans and same-race cultural mentoring programs. Oftentimes we see these programs focus on changing the trajectory of the young person. So basically, when you think about sort of same-race mentoring programs, the focus is on trying to get the young person into college, trying to get the young person to move from one particular behavior to another behavior. And oftentimes, these types of programs feel that having a same-race mentor is often a better approach. So race and ethnicity seem to be celebrated as a strength. Positive racial identity is oftentimes edified through cultural activities and outgoing trip activities. You might visit a museum, you might participate in a Black History Month program. You do those types of activities. So again, focusing on educational success and career development and civic engagement, these are really characteristics of same race and cultural mentoring programs that work well. Next slide. We found that in a program called the Rural After School Program for Latinos, that many of their matches were suffering and they were struggling because at the initial point at which the match occurred, the mentors who were from a non-Latino background had not been sufficiently trained in dealing with some of the issues. So, one of the pitfalls is that programs who oftentimes just think that you can just sort of put mentors together with mentees from different backgrounds because there are no cultural differences, they oftentimes don't think about how the cultural values of the mentors are different from the cultural values of the mentees and their families. Next slide. So as a result, one of the things they found was that mentors who were trained in cultural development issues such as immigration, adolescent development, acculturation, and ethnicity, they improved their relationships. So some of the things that they did, they worked on school projects and tests. They participated in a variety of different sort of cultural specific kinds of activities. One of the things that we talk about in the training that I've done around the country, but also even the program I worked at, is teaching young people how to be bicultural. There's a phrase that academics use that have now sort of filtered down to the layperson. We call it code switching. People from the Latino and African American community know exactly what I'm talking about. So you may speak African American vernacular English in this particular context, and that's acceptable. Then in another setting, you might speak standard English. Same thing would go for Latinos speaking Spanglish. These are the types of culturally appropriate practices that are oftentimes important when mentoring programs are working with and training mentors. Again, empowering young people, in particular Latino students, by fostering a bicultural identity, supporting young people's ties to their native language and rituals. So a lot of the programs will focus on cultural and religious activities that their own communities are already participating, from Cinco de Mayo to Three Kings Day and so on and so forth. These are the kinds of things that programs that recognize and respect the cultural differences of the young people in the communities that they come from. And this has served itself well, and the research supports it. Next slide. Monitoring and support. I won't go over all of the details of this, but again, sort of when we think about the benchmarks, we're thinking about how we need to check in. And I think in the field of mentoring, this is the one area that we really need to do a better job with. So again, some of our programmatic practices, we require, I hate to say we require, but we recommend would probably be a better word, that programs would at least meet with mentors and mentees at least twice per month the first month of the match, and then once a month thereafter. The contact between the mentor and the program staff, along with the family and the mentees, is really, really important. So it's not just from a safety perspective, but it really is vital. And in my experiences, a lot of times matches will fail if mentor and mentees are not connected within that first 1 to 3 months. And sometimes the programs will work really hard to make the match, and then after a few months, the connection between the mentoring program, the mentor, and the family is not there. So it's really important to make sure you sort of standardize what those procedures look like and support both the mentor and the families. And in each particular connection, you should be having your match support specialist or case manager should be talking with the mentee and ideally with the mentee's family as well, just in terms of finding out the connectivity and relationship between the family and the young person and the mentor. Next slide. Again, I think Mike reinforced the importance that these are sort of research-based and evidence-based protocols that we're talking about. This is not just something that we just put together willy-nilly. Mentor has been around for 25 years. We have assessment tools around mentoring relationships that programs can use to test mentor-mentee connectivity and relationships and the quality of that relationship as well. It's really important for programs to make sure that they are monitoring the activities between the adults and the mentees, in particular around community-based mentoring, where the supervision is not necessarily there because it's not a part of the program. Many programs now are moving to sort of monthly community-based activities where mentors and mentees and program staff can get together. But again, it's really important for programs to do that. I can't emphasize that enough. Next slide. So some additional monitoring and support practices. Again, understanding the cultural and class and ethnic and language differences, similarities, making sure that the staff reflects the community that it comes from. Certainly having a diverse staff is important, but making sure that there are people who both through education and their own experiences are able to provide the kind of programmatic and cultural understanding of the communities. And again, I can't emphasize enough, it's important, regardless of your ethnicity or your racial and cultural background, to not just rely on your own experience to guide all your decision making, but to make sure that you're educated about what those particular programmatic practices are, both in managing the relationships, but also understanding the relationship between how you communicate specifically with the mentors and the parents and caregivers. And I always say, when talking about cultural competence, you have to recognize that different isn't deficient, it's just different. And at the close of that, sort of, I know we're kind of wrapping up here in time, I want you to think about community strengths and stressors. As a match support specialist, someone who's done relationship management and has dealt with it, you know, we oftentimes hear the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. We talk about resiliency, we talk about grit, drive. Today, we're talking about a growth mindset and the social capital. But what you also have to remember is, what if the village is ill? What if the village is sick? What if the village has some challenges around poverty, fatherlessness, drugs, violence, unemployment? It's really important to understand that there still are strengths in that community, all right? It's vital for us to recognize and to tease out what those strengths are. And Noel Hurt's research speaks about that in those natural mentors in those communities. Developing a growth mindset, understanding that there is resiliency in those communities, and recognizing that although there are some challenges associated with those communities, that programs need to make sure that they don't come with a deficit mindset. Next slide. So again, some other environmental influences that can impact match support, poverty, we talked about that, the parental age at the child's birth. We have a lot of young single parents, women that may necessarily be looking for a mentor for their child, and recognizing how that can influence documentation status, something that's really important to keep in mind. Incarcerated parents, again, parental or even caregiver deaths, the language that's spoken at the home, and the cultural communication style. And also, as we talked earlier, in particular, African American community, about fictive kin. Those are folks who are not necessarily blood relatives, but there are people who may act as auntie or uncle or cousin and so forth, but play a crucial role in the support network and system of the family. And I think lastly, we need to think about families that come from poverty from their own country of origin, the additional stress that they oftentimes undergo in meeting their basic needs when they're coming to this country. And in particular, sometimes these families are often illiterate in 2 languages. So they might be illiterate in Spanish as well as English. So it's really important to understand all of that when thinking about match support and working with culturally different communities. And on that note, I think I will turn things back over to Michael.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I know folks probably have a bunch of questions for Brian and I, and we'll get there in just a second. I did want to wrap up this part of the presentation by talking a little bit about closure. You know, there are several practices in this new edition that have really enhanced this aspect of mentoring relationships, and many of them, once again, cut across all programs, but I think for serving this population, I would really encourage all of you to think about the different ways that your matches could end and what you can do as a program and a staff to make sure that there is some kind of positive closure to that relationship in every circumstance, even circumstances where the mentor flakes out and abandons the relationship, or you know, some tragedy befalls one of the participants. There, I think mentors are a scarce resource, and I think we always want to make sure they walk away from the experience feeling good about it. But also young people, like I said before, even in a relationship that didn't work out, there's still a lesson to be learned about why it didn't work out, what they can bring to other relationships in their life down the road. So I think at a very basic level, your program should plan around some of the closure reasons that are here on the slide and really figure out what is our policy, what is our procedure around how we handle it under these different circumstances. I know a lot of programs tend to react to matches that maybe blow up and end early by just saying, well, we're going to rematch you, we're going to get you a new mentor. The research is pretty mixed on whether that's a good idea. Sometimes that relationship was damaging enough that the young person maybe should not dive right back into those waters, or maybe needs a little bit of a time to reflect on that. There is other research, however, that shows that sometimes young people can bounce back from a disappointing experience and enter into a more positive relationship with their second mentor. So I'm not going to say don't be rematching when it's needed, but proceed with caution around it. If the young person seems unenthusiastic about it, chances are it's probably not a good idea. I think one additional closure practice that I'll just mention briefly on the next slide is for this particular population of young people, I think it's important to always be emphasizing the expansion of their social capital. There's been a lot of research in recent years around boys and young men of color and the deficits that they have, not just poverty like money poverty, but relationship poverty. And so I think it's imperative that your programs, whenever these relationships end, that there is some kind of handoff to the next mentor in this child's life. who can take them the next step on their journey. And it may be, that's something that certainly can happen during the relationship. There's no reason why your mentors can't be connecting them to other caring adults throughout their mentoring time together. But certainly at the time where they're exiting your program and kind of moving on, I encourage all of you to find ways to do a handoff and teach that young man how to ask for this kind of help and engage mentors throughout their lives. In some ways, that might be the most valuable thing that your program ever does for them. And so please bake that into how you handle the end of the relationships that you create, and encourage this young person to seek other mentors in their lives. Just very quickly, the Elements book does have a section on kind of program management and just kind of running a good nonprofit in general, but it also has a section at the end that kind of gets into what we at Mentor consider to be some of the ethical values and principles of running a good mentoring program. And I think most of those ethical values will resonate with the folks that are on this call. I don't want to preach to the choir here if I don't need to, but I will point out the last bullet here about thinking about how your mentoring program fits into this movement and the effort to build up communities of color more broadly. I had an interesting talk with somebody once that said, mentoring is great, but it seems, to be designed mostly to help individuals raise up out of particular circumstances, and then that's it. That's the end of the story. And while that's valuable, I think thinking about how these young men that you've helped develop can give back to their communities and perhaps break some of the more systemic and long-term things that have been happening in communities of color, and making this part of something that's bigger than just what happens to the individual participants. And so figuring out ways to bring service learning to your work, engaging young people and your mentors in either political action or other activities that leave a real long-term mark on the world around them. I think that's an important principle to this work, especially for these boys and young men. So I'll just wrap up there. I know we probably want to move on to Q&A right now. So Delia and Liz, what do we have in terms of audience questions?
Okay, so thanks Mike, thanks Brian. We've gotten some great thoughtful questions from our participants, and since there's so many of them, we'll just have to focus on some of the most common questions that have come up. The first one is, do you have suggestions for particular resources for assessing mentors' cultural competence or other ways of helping mentors prepare for a match with a mentee who has a different race, ethnicity, or cultural identity than they do?
Yeah, I think that the measures that we referenced there earlier, not quite sure how we can get a hold of them. Maybe Mike and I can kind of circle back with folks. But the assessment tools that Dr. Bernadette Sanchez referenced a little bit earlier, that might be somewhat supportive. But there's also some things that folks can do. I think some of the material that we used in the very first webinar that you all should have access to talk about some cultural competency. There's some tools that I think Desiree and Tamara both spoke to in that initial MBK training.
Yeah, I don't have a recommendation beyond the ones Brian had around a specific assessment instrument that looks at attitudes around race and culture. There is a general one called the Social Interest Scale that I think you can find floating around free on the internet, or at least a variation of it. And it's a short set of questions that basically ask somebody, how interested are you in other people? Which seems like a weird thing to be measuring for a volunteer that's walking into an organization to work with other people. You would think that inherently they would have some kind of interest in doing that and learning about others. But I think what they found in mentoring programs is a fairly surprising high number of folks. People get motivated to help out in this way for a lot of different reasons, and it's not uncommon to have folks walking through your door that have very limited expectations around who they might be matched with and what this experience might look like. And when you start peeling back their opinions about things, you find that they actually aren't that interested in learning about somebody who's different than them. And I think that's probably, more important for programs where you've got an incredibly diverse set of mentors coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. But, this tool, when it's been used in mentoring programs, was predictive of both match length and quality. And, it seems like an obvious thing, like, well, of course, someone who doesn't care to get to know other people isn't going to be a good mentor, but I was surprised to learn how prevalent that can sometimes be. So a lot of that's got to come out, though, in the interview. I think you'll get a better sense from asking questions of folks, in a one-on-one setting than you would from using an instrument in that way.
Okay, great. So the next question that we have is, we're actually getting lots of questions about recruiting and screening the right mentors for programs serving boys and young men of color. So where would you suggest that a program or a practitioner could go to get support in thinking through their criteria for recruiting and screening mentors?
Well, I would start with the elements. The elements of effective practice and the toolkits that we discussed a little bit earlier. Both of those toolkits, the one for African American men and the one for men in what's called Men in Mentoring, I think it's called, Mike.
Yep. Yeah.
I think both of those are great tools for organizations to begin the process. But ultimately, it's about defining who your population is for your mentor. What's your mentor profile? Understanding what characteristics you want as a mentoring program in the mentor, and then just sort of defining exactly what that does. I do a training on recruiting men and men of color and African Americans and Latinos in general. And one of the things I talk about is target messaging and understanding what that model mentor sort of looks like. What are those characteristics? And again, it's not screening out so much as it is screening for both suitability and safety. Mike, you want to add something?
No, I think there's a reason we recommended those two particular resources. I would say in addition to kind of focusing on, who is it we want to reach, I would also emphasize who's making the ultimate ask of them. I've seen a lot of mentoring programs that are, heavily staffed by female employees, and very common in our field and pretty much every youth or education realm is, you've got a pretty heavily female workforce, and it can be intimidating, I think, to men, or make men feel like perhaps this isn't about me or for me. Who is making that ask is almost as important as what's in that ask, I think, and so I would say, emphasize kind of how and where and when you reach people, and who's doing that on your behalf. That isn't to say that folks that, don't have men of color on their staff can't go recruit men of color, but, bring in folks that can help make that feel more comfortable to folks that might be intimidated by some of that.
Okay.
More questions?
Yeah, sure. And finally, we've gotten a number of questions about whether the two of you have any recommendations about particular group-based activities that are effective with boys and young men of color or with youth more broadly.
Yeah, there's lots of different strategies. I think group mentoring, as Mike mentioned earlier, is sort of the preferred method of many of the organizations that are kind of cultural specific. Things like arts programs, sports, activity-based mentoring, just essentially looking at how males, boys in general, sort of engage and interact and how men are attracted to those types of activities. I found both in doing work and doing technical assistance that group mentoring was sort of the preferred method for many male programs, same race and cross race, and that the activities that the mentoring programs engaged with were not just culturally specific, but they were kind of I don't want to say gender specific, but they were sort of geared towards boys, and particularly for older boys. Career activities, having opportunities for the young people to go out and talk to people from blue collar and white collar professionals, actually showing up and listening to them talk about being a mechanic, working in a bank, things of that nature, something that they can kind of touch and feel. And that kind of kinetic work is like activities, a kind of learning style, I think, is more attractive to boys in many ways. Mike?
Yeah, I will echo that. We did a panel discussion in Baltimore this past summer, not long after some of the civil unrest there, and it was a panel of folks talking about how mentoring can be part of the solution for what's going on in their community and other communities around the country. And I'll never forget what a Baltimore City councilman said. He's like, we can tell our young men that they can be anything they want when they grow up, but for the kids in my community, words aren't enough. They have to touch it, right? So you can say, oh, you could work at a bank someday, but it's not until they're about 2 weeks into an internship at a bank where they've actually like done it and are engaged in it that they can start to see themselves actually really being in that role in real life, right? And so I think things that get youth to expand their horizons and really engage in parts of their community that they may not get a chance to engage in much. I mean, you can tell a young person that that's possible, but I think making it hands-on, real, I think for this group of young people is perhaps, you know, very, very critical to that. So that would be kind of my only suggestion on top of what Brian said.
Got time for one more?
I don't think we have time for any more questions, so thank you, Mike and Brian, for such an insightful presentation and discussion. And thank you all for participating in today's webinar. I wanted to mention, first of all, I apologize for the audio issues that we had at the beginning of the webinar. If you missed it, I did mention that you can access previous webinars at mentoring.org. Look under Program Resources, and there you will find our webinar archives, as well as the Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring. You can download that from mentoring.org. The other two resources listed here, the Guide to Recruiting Black Men as Mentors for Black Boys and Men in Mentoring Toolkit, will be uploaded and sent to you later as part of this presentation. And we'll have more information for you on an evidence review of mentoring for Black males coming soon, conducted by Dr. Bernadette Sanchez. You will be receiving a survey via email about your experience today. Please let us know what you think. Your feedback helps to inform future offerings. As I mentioned again at the beginning of the webinar, you'll be able to access recordings on mentoring.org. You'll also receive a follow-up email with information for accessing the recording, the PowerPoint slides, and any resources that we discussed today. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us using the email addresses listed on the screen. We look forward to hearing from all of you. And again, thank you so much for your participation. Have a great rest of the day.